The small Montana town of Lincoln was quiet, almost painfully so. The kind of place where neighbors waved at each other over picket fences, and the loudest sound was the wind through the pines. Yet, on a chilly morning in 1978, a sudden explosion shattered the stillness, sending a paper package's contents into a deadly spray. The world outside this isolated town would never know the face behind the terror, but those who lived in Lincoln would soon be learning that the unthinkable could lurk behind even the most ordinary door. Ted Kaczynski had not always been a name whispered in fear. Once he was a boy of remarkable intellect, skipping grades, solving complex mathematical problems before most children had learned to ride a bicycle. Harvard had called him a prodigy. His professors marveled at his focus, his analytical mind, and his almost uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. Yet brilliance has a price, and for Ted, it came in the form of alienation. While his classmates laughed and formed bonds, he retreated into his mind, building walls as carefully as he would later construct his bombs. By the late 1960s, Ted's path had diverged from that of most men his age. He walked away from academia, leaving behind a promising career in mathematics for the solitude of a small cabin in the wilderness of Montana. The forest became his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could live in what he believed was harmony with nature and away from the machinery of a world he increasingly despised. His cabin was Spartan, containing only the essentials, yet it was a carefully organized laboratory of obsession. In the corner, shelves lined with newspapers, journals, and hand-drawn schematics hinted at the meticulous nature of his mind. On a wooden desk, tools and wires lay neatly arranged, as if waiting for a master craftsman to begin a dark project. Isolation suited Ted's mind, but it did not calm it. As the 1970s progressed, his thoughts darkened. Industrialization, technological dependence, and what he saw as the erosion of human freedom became an obsession. Every piece of mail, every news headline, every industrial boom seemed to confirm a single truth in his mind. Society had gone wrong, and someone needed to act. That someone, he decided, would be himself. The first bomb was not built in haste. Ted spent weeks, then months perfecting his craft. He read manuals on explosives, studied chemistry, and meticulously tested components, always taking care to avoid leaving evidence of his presence. His first packages were small, unassuming, and deadly. The plan was simple in theory: strike fear, make a point, and remain invisible. When the first bomb detonated in Lincoln, the community recoiled in horror. Authorities were baffled. No fingerprints, no suspects, no motive. Ted watched from the shadows, anonymous and calculating. He noted every detail in his journals: the reactions of the media, the behavior of investigators, the rising panic in small communities. Each entry was clinical, almost detached, but underneath lay the simmering intensity of a man convinced of his own mission. Ted's personality had always been dual. To the world, he was the recluse, a harmless hermit lost among the trees. Yet beneath that quiet exterior was a mind sharp enough to calculate trajectories, design lethal mechanisms, and anticipate the actions of law enforcement. He was a hunter in every sense of the word, but his prey was not an animal. It was the modern world itself. The narrative of his life in those early years at the cabin is punctuated by moments of eerie normalcy. He chopped wood, hunted for food, and kept a journal with meticulous attention to detail. Yet the peacefulness of his surroundings was a stark contrast to the storm building within him. He spoke little, interacted with no one, and observed the world through the lens of someone preparing for a battle that only he could see. In the evenings, after tending to the necessities of survival, Ted would sit by candlelight, constructing his devices with methodical patience. Every wire, every powder, every trigger mechanism was placed with precision. One misstep could ruin everything, and he could not afford mistakes. He was driven by a sense of purpose that bordered on obsession, a belief that his actions were not only justified but necessary to awaken the world to its folly. Even as he planned these acts, he remained acutely aware of the stakes. A slip could mean capture, prison, or death, but risk only sharpened his focus. He considered every possibility, from the type of paper used for his packages to the methods by which the bombs would be delivered. Ted Kaczynski was not motivated by malice alone. He was motivated by ideology, by a desire to enact a vision of justice on a scale few could comprehend. The first victims were chosen seemingly at random, yet in Ted's mind there was purpose. University professors, air mine executives, and others who symbolized the industrial technological society were carefully targeted. The public saw tragedy and terror. Ted saw a statement being made. Every explosion was a message, every letter a manifesto in progress, though the world did not yet understand the depth of his convictions. Authorities were mystified. Investigators struggled to connect the dots, initially attributing the attacks to isolated incidents or small-time criminals. Ted watched from the shadows, anonymous and calculating. He noted every detail in his journals, the reactions of the media, the behavior of investigators, the rising panic in small communities. Each entry was clinical, almost detached, but underneath lay the simmering intensity of a man convinced of his own mission. By the end of part 1, the audience knows Ted Kaczynski not only as a murderer, but a mind unlike any other, brilliant, isolated, and terrifyingly methodical. The tension is palpable, the stakes immense, and the shadow of his next move looms over the nation. The stage is set for a deadly campaign that will span decades, challenging law enforcement, the media, and the public in ways no one could have imagined.
The sun rose over Chicago on a crisp morning in 1980, its rays glinting off the skyscrapers. But beneath the ordinary bustle, a shadow had begun to creep across the nation. In offices, homes, and post offices, citizens opened letters with suspicion. Something was wrong. The Unabomber was no longer an isolated threat. He was becoming a symbol of fear that stretched far beyond the forests of Montana. Ted Kaczynski's campaign had evolved. The early bombings had been enough to shock, but he wanted more than terror. He wanted attention. His ideology, scribbled in journals and refined over years of isolation, demanded a stage. Every package he sent was a calculated step in a decades-long strategy, a way to puncture the complacency of a society he viewed as enslaved by technology. By now, the FBI had assembled a task force. Agents pored over the scant evidence left at bomb sites, fragments of metal, traces of explosives, a piece of paper with a partial return address. They were chasing shadows, every lead turning into another dead end. In interviews, colleagues of victims painted a picture of randomness, making the pattern difficult to detect. Yet the task force suspected a single, meticulous mind was behind these attacks, a mind unlike any they had encountered. Meanwhile, Ted's letters had begun to circulate beyond law enforcement. Small newspaper columns reported strange mailings, cryptic threats, and a growing list of injured victims. Each letter reflected the mind of a recluse with a razor-sharp intellect, careful grammar, precise phrasing, ideological rhetoric. Though the public saw a faceless terrorist, his words offered glimpses into a philosophy that rejected industrial progress, questioned government authority, and demanded a return to what he perceived as humanity's natural state. The letters were as much psychological warfare as they were communication. One arrived at a prominent university with a bomb inside, addressed to a technology professor whose work Ted deemed destructive. The professor survived, but the letter left a trail of questions and fear. The FBI studied the missives for patterns, looking for handwriting, phrasing, and timing that could reveal the culprit. Each letter increased public anxiety, as if a dark figure moved unseen among the streets and offices of America. Ted's planning was exhaustive. He observed the mail system, experimented with delivery times, and perfected the art of misdirection. The letters themselves became a method of control. Through them, he dictated not just who might live or die, but how the nation felt: anxious, paranoid, vulnerable. People checked mail multiple times a day, workplaces instituted X-ray machines, and the media amplified the fear with daily headlines. The invisible enemy had a face in the form of words, carefully crafted, ideologically charged, and terrifyingly precise. Agents within the FBI began to profile him. They described a man highly intelligent, socially isolated, and deeply familiar with the workings of the modern world. The profile suggested a reclusive loner with obsessive tendencies, a perfectionist who could construct lethal devices while avoiding detection. This image of the Unabomber clashed with the public's expectation of a criminal. He was not a typical felon. He was methodical, ideological, and invisible. The escalation was deliberate and terrifying. In 1985, a package exploded at a university mailroom, injuring a secretary who had only opened it to sort the mail. Panic spread. Newspapers splashed headlines warning of more potential attacks. Offices installed new screening procedures. Entire communities were affected, gripped by an invisible terror that could strike anywhere at any time. Ted watched from his cabin, isolated but ever aware of his influence. The letters he sent had a reach far greater than he himself could travel, a mind controlling events from the shadows. Yet, while the public feared him, the FBI struggled to act. Each device was unique, a new iteration designed to thwart forensic analysis. Ted learned from each success and failure, adapting with a cunning that kept him always a step ahead. Investigators had few clues, save for the rare signature of his intellectual patterns, the careful choice of targets, the methodical assembly, the ideological focus of the accompanying letters. It was as if the bombs themselves were footnotes to a manifesto that had yet to be published. Ted's own psychological landscape became a central feature of the narrative. In his journals, he reflected on society's reliance on machines, the corrupting influence of technology, and the loss of human freedom. These thoughts were not abstract musings, they were instructions for action. Each bomb, each letter, each threat was informed by an ideology that saw violence as a necessary catalyst. It was a chilling portrait, a man convinced that the end justified any means, prepared to commit murder to awaken the world. Across the country, ordinary Americans felt the ripple effects. A mother in California hesitated to check her mail. A student in New York watched for suspicious packages. An airline executive tightened security. Ted's reach was psychological as well as physical. Fear became his accomplice, anxiety his tool. The narrative shows this spread of terror like a shadow creeping across the nation, touching everyone, shaping their behavior, and yet leaving no tangible trace of the perpetrator. Despite the terror, Ted remained almost entirely invisible. Friends of his few acquaintances described him as polite but distant, uninterested in human interaction, more comfortable with the written word than conversation. These glimpses of his personal life painted a stark contrast. The man capable of devastating violence was also deeply, almost painfully ordinary in social interactions. It was this ordinariness that made him even more terrifying, a hidden monster in plain sight. By the mid-1980s, Ted's campaign had not only intensified but become systematic. The FBI's files grew thicker, agents' frustration deeper. Each bombing increased public scrutiny, yet Ted remained one step ahead. He monitored the news, adjusted his methods, and refined his ideological narrative. His letters now carried warnings, philosophical arguments, and subtle threats, a mix of psychological manipulation and moral declaration. They were not just instructions, they were instruments of terror, shaping the nation's consciousness as surely as the explosions shaped the landscape of destruction. The part ends with a sense of growing dread. America is under siege from a foe unseen, yet omnipresent in letters, bombs, and ideology. Ted Kaczynski's campaign is no longer merely criminal, it's a psychological war, a study in fear and control. The audience is left aware that this is just the beginning. The stakes are higher, the threat more refined, and the man behind it all is still at large, watching, planning, and striking again.
By the late 1980s, the country had begun to feel the Unabomber's presence as more than just random terror. His bombs, carefully engineered and ruthlessly executed, had left a trail of injury, fear, and death. Law enforcement now realized this was not the work of a typical criminal. It was the operation of a singularly brilliant and meticulous mind. And the nation was beginning to feel trapped in a game of cat and mouse it could not see. Ted Kaczynski, ensconced in his Montana cabin, had become a ghost in the wilderness. He lived without electricity, relying on books, journals, and his own intellect to navigate both daily survival and his campaign of violence. From the outside, he seemed almost mythic, a recluse capable of striking anywhere, anytime, leaving behind only smoke and riddles. The cabin itself, small and unassuming, belied the mind within. Every tool had its place, every blueprint was meticulously drawn, every component accounted for. It was a nest of intellect and obsession. Investigators intensified their efforts. FBI task forces expanded, integrating criminal profiling with emerging behavioral analysis techniques. The agency's most experienced agents pored over bomb fragments, letters, and the sparse eyewitness accounts. Slowly, patterns emerged, patterns of timing, construction, and target selection. It became clear that Ted Kaczynski was not just a bomber, but a philosopher turned assassin targeting symbols of the industrial technological world he despised. Despite this, he remained elusive. Close calls became part of the narrative. Once, investigators traced a suspicious vehicle to a remote Montana dirt road, only to find that it had been abandoned long before. Another time, a local hiker discovered a hidden cache of materials, prompting an investigation that came empty-handed. Ted seemed to anticipate every move, using his understanding of human behavior to stay ahead of the law. Each narrow escape deepened the tension for both the FBI and the audience, creating a palpable sense of suspense. Meanwhile, Ted's communications evolved. Letters became more sophisticated, combining philosophical rhetoric with subtle threats. He demanded that his manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, be published, presenting his ideology to the world while holding lives in the balance. In the letters, he argued that technology enslaved humanity and that violent action was a necessary step to awaken society. The public received these letters with a mix of horror and fascination, debating whether publishing them might prevent further attacks or unintentionally glorify the Unabomber. Ted's psychological portrait grew more disturbing with each act. Inside the cabin, he moved with mechanical precision, constructing devices while maintaining the routine of survival. He rationed food, chopped wood, and tracked weather patterns, all while plotting mailings that would strike fear nationwide. In his mind, every human was either a participant in the industrial system he loathed or a potential obstacle. Moral ambiguity was absent, purpose and ideology justified any act. This detachment heightened the chilling nature of his crimes. He was methodical, patient, and utterly unflinching. The FBI, desperate for leads, leaned on behavioral science more than ever. Agents studied the writings and the letters, seeking unique linguistic fingerprints. They compared phraseology, punctuation, and syntax across different mailings, searching for consistency. Slowly, they began to construct a profile, a reclusive, highly intelligent man with survivalist tendencies and a hatred of modern society. He was likely living off the grid, disconnected from communities, and yet still engaged in a deadly dialogue with the world through his mail. The tension escalated with each bombing. In 1987, a package intended for an airline executive killed a secretary instead, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of Ted's violence. Public fear was at its peak. Every mailroom, every office, every home became a potential target. Citizens were advised to inspect letters carefully. Workplaces implemented X-ray machines and metal detectors. Ted's psychological warfare had succeeded. The nation was now constantly aware of him, yet utterly powerless to stop him. The media played a critical role in the narrative. Newspapers and television covered the Unabomber's campaign extensively, and the publication of some of his letters created a perverse dialogue with the public. Ted's ideology, once private musings in a secluded cabin, now infiltrated living rooms across America. This exposure amplified his sense of mission. He was no longer invisible, he was becoming a specter haunting society, dictating behavior and fear without ever stepping outside his cabin. Ted's planning was both meticulous and adaptive. After each attack, he studied the law enforcement response, noting investigative techniques, news coverage, and public reactions. He refined his devices, learning from mistakes while increasing sophistication. His letters grew longer, more persuasive, and increasingly manipulative. Each communication was a demonstration of intellect, control, and psychological dominance. The story in Part 3 also humanizes the victims. Families grieve, communities panic, and the FBI faces mounting pressure to protect citizens while capturing the elusive bomber. Agents work around the clock, piecing together fragments of evidence, yet the Unabomber always seems one step ahead. This cat-and-mouse dynamic creates suspense and maintains engagement, keeping the audience invested in the hunt. By the late 1980s, the FBI had reached a critical turning point. They realized that the Unabomber was likely someone from a highly educated background, possibly a recluse living alone in the wilderness. Every lead, every clue, every scrap of paper became a piece of a vast, intricate puzzle. Yet despite near misses and escalating tension, Ted remained undetected. Each failure weighed heavily on the investigators, their frustration mirrored in the narrative's suspenseful pacing. By the early 1990s, the country had grown weary of fear, its citizens weary of uncertainty. Ted Kaczynski's shadow had loomed over America for more than a decade, a ghostly figure whose deadly letters and meticulously engineered bombs had left destruction in their wake. Yet for all the devastation, Ted had remained untouchable, a recluse in Montana, invisible yet omnipresent. It was a small detail, almost imperceptible, that ultimately brought him down. David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother, had been following the news coverage of the Unabomber's manifesto, published in 1995 by major newspapers in hopes of preventing further attacks. The philosophical arguments, the style of writing, the carefully structured sentences all struck a familiar chord. With growing unease, David realized the voice behind the manifesto sounded like Ted. Every paragraph mirrored a style he had known since childhood. Every ideological obsession reflected a man he had grown up with. David wrestled with disbelief, guilt, and fear. Could his brother really be the Unabomber? Could someone so quiet, so intellectual, capable of long periods of solitary reflection, also be a murderer? The letters he submitted to the FBI for analysis would ultimately provide the breakthrough law enforcement needed, the pieces of the puzzle that had eluded investigators for nearly 2 decades suddenly clicked into place. Meanwhile, Ted remained unaware that the trap was closing. His routine continued in the cabin, chopping wood, tinkering with devices, drafting letters. Each action was deliberate, calculated, obsessive. To him, the FBI was always a few steps behind, the public always ignorant, and his mission unwavering. Yet the walls of his isolation were about to crumble, not through a dramatic chase, but through the quiet persistence of family and forensic linguistics. The FBI acted quickly. Agents descended on the Montana cabin, their movements precise, tactical, and deliberate. The moment of confrontation was tense, cinematic. Ted, calm and measured, confronted men with guns and authority, the same men who had chased shadows for years. He did not resist violently, but his presence, calm and intellectual, radiated a chilling certainty. He was still in control, even as the law finally closed in. In the cabin, investigators found evidence that confirmed their suspicions. Bomb-making materials, journals filled with ideology and calculation, and detailed plans for future attacks. The meticulous nature of Ted's work was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Every detail had been considered, every precaution taken, every action calculated. It was the final proof of a decades-long campaign executed with precision, patience, and relentless focus. The nation watched as Ted Kaczynski was brought to court. The trial was unprecedented, a mix of criminal proceedings and media spectacle. Prosecutors presented evidence of bombings that had injured and killed innocent people, letters that contained threats and philosophical justifications, and a pattern of methodical preparation that spanned decades. Psychologists and experts testified about Ted's mind, dissecting the interplay of genius, ideology, and isolation. Ted's defense argued for insanity, presenting him as a man whose intellect had been warped by obsessive thoughts and social isolation. Yet the prosecution countered with the meticulousness of his planning, the awareness of consequences, and the ideological clarity behind each act. The courtroom drama was intense, a moral and legal battleground that captured the nation's attention. Viewers and citizens debated the balance between punishment, mental illness, and accountability, reflecting the broader societal questions that the Unabomber had forced upon the public. Throughout the proceedings, Ted remained composed, almost eerily so. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the devastation of his crimes. He read legal documents carefully, sometimes responding in concise, deliberate statements, never betraying panic, fear, or remorse. The courtroom became a stage for his intellect as much as a trial for his violence. The verdict was inevitable. Ted Kaczynski was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence closed the chapter on one of the most infamous criminal campaigns in American history. But it also left lingering questions. How does society recognize genius when it masks such darkness? How could a man so brilliant, so disciplined, become so violent? And could such an individual emerge again? The aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom. Victims and their families were left to navigate trauma, grief, and the long shadow of fear. Communities that once gone about their routines now carried a lingering wariness of the unseen. The FBI and law enforcement agencies reflected on investigative strategies, criminal profiling, and the importance of connecting minute details that might otherwise go unnoticed. The capture of Ted Kaczynski would serve as both a cautionary tale and a case study for generations of investigators to come. Ted's writings, once private, now became public documents. Scholars, journalists, and psychologists pored over industrial society and its future, seeking to understand not only the ideas but the mind behind them. Some found disturbing genius, others found irrational extremism. All recognized that Ted's campaign had been both ideological and meticulously methodical, combining terror, intellect, and obsession in a way few had ever seen. Even in prison, Ted remained a figure of fascination and fear. Letters he wrote, interviews he gave, and reflections on society's trajectory continued to provoke discussion. He had forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truth about technology, industrialization, and the vulnerabilities inherent in modern life, but at a cost measured in lives, fear, and devastation.